Originals. Découvrez en avant-première nos interviews sur les séries qui font l'actu.
Dans cet épisode d'Originals, on est avec Dan Stevens à l'occasion de la sortie de Gaslit, la mini-série qui s'intéresse au Watergate, disponible sur Starzplay dès le 24 avril. Hi Dan.
Bonjour.
In this new take on the Watergate, you're playing John Dean, a real-life, still alive character or person. So how do you approach this type of role, especially when the person is so public, you know?
Yeah, well, fortunately, for research purposes, there's a number of books on the issue and also hundreds of hours of footage of the hearings at the time. And John Dean, the man himself, is still alive and still very much on CNN on a regular basis, especially in the last few years, sort of as their resident corruption expert. So, there's a lot to study, just from a sort of aesthetic point of view, from mannerisms, his way of talking. And it's a pretty fascinating, period to dive into anyway. But yeah, there's lots of rich material.
The topic is a bit delicate, so I suppose you haven't met the man himself, right?
I didn't. No. I could have done. I don't know if it would have made any difference really. I think at a certain point, you do the research, you absorb everything you need to absorb, and then it has to become its own thing. And we're telling our version of the story. I'm not seeking to do a specific impression of John Dean. I want to gain an impression of him and then have that sort of become a part of our story.
Gaslit is adapted from the podcast Slowburn when it focused on the Watergate, obviously. So was the podcast like your bedtime story for a while? Are you a big podcast listener?
I am, yeah. And my wife and I loved Slowburn. It was so fascinating. And I think, living in the United States for 10 years now, I've always tried to gain a little more interest in the system there, the way of working, how different American politics is to British politics, how similar some of it is. But that podcast is a really eye-opening one in terms of the number of characters who you don't normally hear about when people mention Watergate. Martha Mitchell, Mo Dean, Frank Wills, all of these characters really get a spotlight in our show, and their stories are foregrounded. And I think that's it's very refreshing, it's very interesting, and really helps you reconsider a period of American history, or world history.
It's interesting because the show is airing when distrust towards politicians is probably at an all-time high these days everywhere in the world. It's the 24th. It's actually election day in France.
Is it really?
Yes. Wow. So in your opinion, what's the message behind the show in these troubled times? Are we really supposed to, trust our politicians, or,
Well, you'd hope so. I mean, I think, in an ideal world, people go into politics to make a difference and effect change. Unfortunately, it often attracts the wrong people who are attracted to power and obsessed with holding on to that power and getting a seat on Air Force One, or sitting near the president. Things that have nothing to do with public service, civil service, and a sort of moral conscience. And I think one of the lessons from John Dean is that it's always the right time to do the right thing. I think there's so much ill and wrong and corruption in almost any administration. And I think it's very important that people speak truth to power.
Mm-hmm. In pre-production, you replaced Armie Hammer, who had been announced beforehand. As an actor, what goes through your mind when you accept a replacement,
It happens all the time. Tom Selleck was supposed to be Indiana Jones originally, and I can't imagine how it would be, without Harrison Ford in that role. And I'm sure Harrison Ford for a minute was like, oh God, Tom Selleck, what was he going to do? But ultimately, I make it my own, and so you accept the ball and you run with it in your direction. So, I'm sure any number of actors would have played this part very differently, but you get my version.
Yeah, a good version, of course. Overall, the series is quite serious, but actually your character brings a touch of humor in the story, with lighter moments with your wife, for example, or even your whole behavior. So was it written that way, or did you add this humorous side?
I think there was an element of it in the script. I think there's something inherently absurd about Watergate and the people involved, and it is very much a story that goes between, thrilling drama and absurd comedy. And Matt Ross very much cast the show with comedic-leaning actors who have a facility for comedy, who recognize the absurdity in some of the scenes, who can kind of, without playing it for laughs, it's not like we're sort of, playing broad comedy, but, to have that sense of humor about how ridiculous it was, I think really helps. And there's a real wit to the script and to the way that the story zips along, I think.
Your co-stars are obviously household names. How exciting was it to exchange lines with Sean Penn, of course, and working under the directions of Sam Esmail?
Yeah, I mean, just an incredible team, and of course, to get to work with Sean Penn and Julia Roberts, who have been, movie stars since before I was born, and it was an incredible experience, and you learn a huge amount from just watching and observing them working, and just hope that your work can match them in the scene. And John Mitchell is a very intimidating character played by the very intimidating Sean Penn, and so a lot of that feeds into the scene. Here I am sat in front of Sean Penn playing John Mitchell. This is it's all working.
In your mind, do you think John Dean is a good guy, or did it just change his mind because it benefited him?
That's a really good question. I mean, I don't think anybody ever thinks of themselves as a bad guy, and I think he was desperate to get ahead. He's like many others in Washington, incredibly ambitious and willing to compromise a lot to advance his own position. I think very much under the tutelage of his wife, was persuaded to do what many would see as the right thing. It depends who you talk to in America to this day, how John Dean is viewed, either as a rat or as a hero. And I think that's one of the fascinating things about it, is that, there are different ways of looking at all of these scenarios and all of these characters. But ultimately, they were all not really doing the right thing.
Wow. Like you've said, you've spent 10 years now in the US. Will we see you again in a British show one day?
I think so. Yes, absolutely. I'm trying to think of the last British thing I did, but yeah, occasionally I
a while ago.
And, I've been playing more Germans lately than Brits, but of course.
And just to wrap this up, what's the last TV show you've binged?
The last TV show I binged, probably Pam and Tommy. I enjoyed it a lot more than I thought I was going to, and a really, again, just a very interesting deep dive into a little moment in sort of media history, really, that I had never really given that much thought to, but it was really fun and very fascinating.
Well, thank you very much.
C'était un épisode d'Originals avec Dan Stevens, et vous pouvez retrouver Gaslit dès le 24 avril sur Starzplay.
Originals. Découvrez en avant-première nos interviews sur les séries qui font l'actu.